The Louisville courthouse stood tall and imposing against the gray October sky of 1974. Marble columns framed the entrance like silent sentinels, watching as people hurried up and down the steps, their collars turned up against the autumn chill. Inside, the polished wooden benches of Courtroom 3 were already filling with the day's observers, their hushed whispers creating a soft hum beneath the high ceiling. Khalila Ali sat quietly in the back row, her slender fingers clasped tightly in her lap. At 24, she carried herself with a natural dignity that belied her youth. Her modest dress and headscarf marked her as Muslim, though few in the Kentucky courthouse recognized the significance. The simple gold band on her finger caught the light as she adjusted her position, trying to remain inconspicuous. If this story has already made you feel something, no matter how small, don't leave without giving back. Comment and tell me where you're watching this video from, and subscribe to the channel. The case being heard that morning had nothing to do with Khalila directly. She had come to support Jamila Jackson, a friend from the local Muslim community who was fighting an eviction notice. Jamila, a widow with 3 children, had been accused of violating her lease by running a business from her apartment, when in reality, she had merely been teaching neighborhood children to read the Quran. As a black Muslim woman in the South, Jamila faced an uphill battle in the courtroom, and Khalila had promised to be there for moral support. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Preston," announced the bailiff, his voice echoing through the room. The judge, a man in his 60s with thinning white hair and half-moon spectacles, swept into the courtroom with an air of impatience. He settled into his chair with a slight grunt before waving a hand dismissively at the gathered crowd. "Be seated," he muttered, already shuffling through the papers before him. Assistant District Attorney Richard Brennan stood with confidence, his expensive suit and perfectly knotted tie projecting an image of authority. At 35, he had built a reputation as someone who could dispatch these minor housing cases with ruthless efficiency. He glanced briefly toward Jamila, who sat beside her court-appointed attorney, a nervous young man fresh out of law school who kept adjusting his tie. "Your Honor," Brennan began, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom, "this is a straightforward case of lease violation. Mrs. Jackson has been operating an unauthorized business from her residence at Oakwood Apartments, in direct violation of Section 4.3 of her rental agreement." Judge Preston nodded, barely looking up from his notes. "And the defense?" Jamila's young attorney stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor, my client was simply providing religious instruction to children in the community, not running a business. There was no profit involved, merely a service to—" "Were there regular gatherings of non-residents in the apartment?" interrupted the judge. "Well, yes, but— "And did these gatherings occur on a scheduled basis?" "They did, Your Honor, but—" Judge Preston waved a hand dismissively. "It sounds like organized activity to me, regardless of whether money changed hands." "Mr. Brennan, what is the landlord seeking?" "Immediate eviction, Your Honor, plus court costs." The young defense attorney looked stricken. "Your Honor, Mrs. Jackson is a widow with 3 small children. If evicted, she has nowhere to go. Surely we can reach some accommodation." "The law is clear," Brennan interjected smoothly. "The lease terms were violated. The landlord is entirely within his rights." From her seat in the back, Khalila felt her heart sink as she watched the proceedings. The judge was barely listening to Jamila's side, and her inexperienced attorney was clearly outmatched. When the morning recess was called, Khalila slipped out of her row and made her way to Jamila, who sat with her head bowed, fighting back tears. "They're not even listening," Jamila whispered, her voice breaking. "My children. Where will we go?" Khalila squeezed her friend's hand. "This isn't over yet," she said quietly. "I'm going to speak with your attorney." As Khalila approached the young lawyer, who was frantically shuffling through his notes, she could hear Brennan speaking to one of his colleagues near the prosecution table. "Another open and shut case," Brennan was saying with a chuckle. "Did you see that headscarf? Probably can't even understand half of what's being said. These people need to learn that rules apply to everyone, even them." Khalila paused, her back straightening almost imperceptibly. She had heard similar comments throughout her life, dismissive, condescending remarks about her faith, her appearance, her intelligence. With each step toward the defense table, her resolve strengthened. This was no longer just about Jamila's eviction case. This was about dignity and respect, things her husband had fought for his entire career, both inside and outside the boxing ring. When court resumed after the recess, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of courtroom 3. Khalila Ali was no longer seated in the back row. Instead, she sat directly behind Jamila, her posture straight and her gaze steady. She had spent the break speaking intensely with Jamila's attorney, Michael Bennett, who now seemed less nervous and more focused as he arranged his documents. "The defense would like to call a witness, Your Honor," Bennett announced as soon as proceedings resumed. Judge Preston looked up, clearly surprised. "A witness for a simple eviction hearing?" "Yes, Your Honor." "The defense calls Mrs. Khalila Ali to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Khalila rose gracefully and walked to the witness stand. Most people didn't recognize the name, but a few heads turned in sudden recognition. The bailiff administered the oath, which Khalila took with solemn dignity, her voice clear and steady. Brennan leaned toward his assistant, whispering loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Who does she think she is? Some kind of expert on housing law?" His smirk was reflected on the faces of his colleagues. Bennett began his questioning. "Mrs. Ali, could you please tell the court about your relationship with Mrs. Jackson?" "Jamila and I attend the same mosque," Khalila replied. "I've known her for 3 years, since my husband and I moved to Louisville." "And what can you tell us about the activities that took place in Mrs. Jackson's apartment?" "Jamila teaches children from our community to read and understand the Quran. This is a fundamental aspect of our faith, not a business venture. The children gather twice a week, and parents take turns bringing snacks. No money changes hands." Judge Preston adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Lee, while I appreciate your testimony, the issue at hand is whether these gatherings constitute a violation of the lease agreement, not whether they are religious in nature." Khalila nodded respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor. However, I believe there's a distinction to be made between commercial activity and community service. The Oakwood Apartments lease prohibits using the residence for business purposes, but Mrs. Jackson receives no compensation for her teaching." Brennan stood, his face flushed with irritation. "Your Honor, this witness has no legal expertise. Her opinions on lease interpretation are irrelevant." "Actually," Khalila responded before the judge could speak, "I studied contract law at Rutgers University before my husband's career required us to relocate. I'm quite familiar with the distinction between commercial and non-commercial activities as defined in standard residential leases." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Preston blinked in surprise while Brennan's smirk faltered. "Furthermore," Khalila continued, her voice gaining confidence, "the Fair Housing Act protects religious practices within private residences, provided they don't disrupt other tenants or damage property. There have been no complaints from neighbors about noise or disturbance, as Mrs. Jackson's teaching sessions are quiet and orderly." Brennan recovered quickly. "But Your Honor, regardless of this witness's claimed education, the fact remains that regular gatherings of non-residents constitute organized activity prohibited by the lease." "If I may," Khalila countered, "the lease specifically prohibits business operations and commercial enterprises. It does not prohibit private gatherings, religious study groups, or community activities. If it did, it would also prohibit birthday parties, family dinners, and book clubs, all of which regularly occur at Oakwood without objection from management." Judge Preston was now watching Khalila with growing interest. "Mrs. Ali, you seem unusually well-versed in these matters for someone who is simply a friend of the defendant. My husband has taught me that understanding the law is essential to ensuring justice, Your Honor. When you've watched someone you love fight systematic bias in the courts, you learn to pay attention to the details." Brennan's patience was wearing thin. "And who exactly is your husband, Mrs. Ali, that his experiences are relevant to these proceedings?" Khalila met his gaze directly. "My husband is Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Perhaps you've heard of his legal battles with the United States government over his conscientious objector status. He sacrificed 3 years of his career defending his constitutional rights against those who would dismiss him based on prejudice rather than law. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Preston banged his gavel, calling for order. Brennan's face had drained of color, his earlier condescension replaced by visible discomfort as he realized who he had been dismissing so casually. "Your Honor," Khalila continued, once the room had quieted, "this case may seem minor compared to others on your docket, but to Jamila Jackson and her 3 children, it represents their home, their security, and their dignity. All we ask is that the law be applied fairly, without bias or presumption." The atmosphere in courtroom 3 had transformed completely. Reporters who had been dozing in the back row were now fully alert, scribbling notes furiously. Court officers who had been chatting casually by the doors now stood at attention, watching the proceedings with newfound interest. Even Judge Preston sat straighter in his chair, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by careful consideration. Brennan, attempting to regain control of the situation, approached the witness stand with forced confidence. "Mrs. Ali, while your husband's celebrity is certainly noteworthy, it has no bearing on the legal matters at hand." Khalila's expression remained composed. "I didn't mention my husband's name to impress the court, Mr. Brennan. I mentioned it to illustrate a point about presumption and prejudice. Just minutes ago, I overheard you referring to me as someone who probably can't even understand half of what's being said. You made assumptions about my intelligence and understanding based solely on my appearance." Brennan's face flushed crimson. "I object, Your Honor. This is hearsay and irrelevant to the case." "Actually," interrupted Judge Preston, "I'm inclined to hear Mrs. Ali out." "Please continue, ma'am." "Thank you, Your Honor," Khalila said with a slight nod. "My point is simply this. The same biases and assumptions that led Mr. Brennan to dismiss me without knowing me are at work in this case against Jamila Jackson. Her activities have been labeled a business without proper investigation into their nature. The lease prohibits commercial enterprises, not religious education." She turned slightly to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, there's legal precedent for this distinction. In Martinez v. Bynum, 1983, the Supreme Court recognized that residential settings often serve as places of religious instruction without constituting commercial activity. And in the case of Grace United Methodist Church v. City of Cheyenne, the 10th Circuit held that religious instruction in private homes is protected both by the First Amendment and by federal housing regulations. Brennan looked stunned as Khalila cited legal precedents with ease. Judge Preston removed his glasses, wiping them thoughtfully with a handkerchief. "Mr. Brennan," the judge said finally, "did the landlord provide Mrs. Jackson with any written warnings about these gatherings before pursuing eviction?" Brennan hesitated. I'm not certain, Your Honor." "And was there any investigation into whether these gatherings constituted a business as defined by the lease, or were they simply assumed to be in violation?" The landlord assumed," Khalila interjected. "Just as you assumed I was uneducated based on my headscarf." The young defense attorney, Bennett, seemed to have found his courage. He stood, a document in hand. "Your Honor, we have statements from 5 neighbors at Oakwood Apartments attesting that Mrs. Jackson's gatherings caused no disturbance. We also have a letter from the imam of our mosque confirming the religious and non-commercial nature of her teaching." Judge Preston nodded, turning his attention back to Khalila. "Mrs. Ali, I appreciate your testimony today. It has been enlightening. You may step down." As Khalila returned to her seat beside Jamila, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following her. The whispers had grown louder, and several people were pointing discreetly. News that Muhammad Ali's wife was present had spread quickly. Judge Preston cleared his throat. "In light of the testimony and evidence presented, I'm not convinced that Mrs. Jackson's activities constitute a business operation as prohibited by her lease. Furthermore, I find the landlord's failure to provide written warning before pursuing eviction to be procedurally improper." He paused, looking directly at Brennan. "The court rules in favor of the defendant. The eviction notice is rescinded, and Mrs. Jackson may continue to reside at Oakwood Apartments. However," he added, looking now at Jamila, "I would advise you to maintain these gatherings at a reasonable size and during appropriate hours to ensure continued harmony with your neighbors." Relief washed over Jamila's face as she reached for Khalila's hand, squeezing it tightly in gratitude. Bennett was beaming, gathering his papers with new confidence. But it was Brennan's expression that captured Khalila's attention, a mixture of embarrassment, respect, and the uncomfortable recognition of his own prejudice laid bare. As the court adjourned and people began to file out, reporters surged forward, eager to speak with Muhammad Ali's wife, but Khalila gently declined interviews, keeping her arm around Jamila's shoulders as they moved toward the exit. "Mrs. Ali," called a voice behind them. It was Judge Preston, who had stepped down from the bench and approached them with an outstretched hand. "I want to thank you for your contribution today. It's been educational." Khalila shook his hand, a small smile playing at her lips. "Justice doesn't always require a famous name, Your Honor, but sometimes it does require someone to pay attention to the details." The autumn sun had broken through the clouds by the time Khalila and Jamila descended the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the plaza. News of what had transpired in Courtroom 3 had spread quickly, and a small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers had gathered outside. "Mrs. Ali! Mrs. Ali!" they called, cameras flashing and notepads at the ready. "Oh, can you comment on today's proceedings?" Khalila kept her arm protectively around Jamila's shoulders, guiding her through the crowd with practiced ease. After years of being married to one of the most famous men in the world, she had learned to navigate public attention with grace and purpose. "Today wasn't about me," she said finally, pausing at the bottom of the steps. "It was about ensuring that a widow and her children weren't unfairly removed from their home because of misunderstanding and prejudice. That's all I have to say." As they continued walking toward the parking lot, a familiar figure emerged from a black sedan parked at the curb. Muhammad Ali, towering and magnificent even in a simple suit, stepped forward to meet them. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized the heavyweight champion, and several onlookers began to applaud spontaneously. "My queen," Ali said softly, embracing Khalila with pride shining in his eyes. "I heard what happened in there. You fought beautifully." Khalila smiled up at her husband. "I learned from the best." Ali turned to Jamila, taking her hand gently in his massive one. "Sister, are you all right?" Jamila nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thanks to Khalila, my children still have a home. Allah is merciful, and Allah works through good people," Ali replied, his famous voice soft but powerful. "Come, let us get you home to your children. They must be worried." As they walked toward the car, Assistant District Attorney Brennan emerged from the courthouse, briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He hesitated when he saw the small group, clearly uncertain whether to approach or hurry past. After a moment's deliberation, he squared his shoulders and walked directly toward them. "Mrs. Ali," he said, his voice strained but determined, I owe you an apology. My comments earlier were unprofessional and prejudiced. I was wrong." The crowd around them had fallen silent, watching the exchange with rapt attention. Khalila regarded Brennan thoughtfully, aware that her husband had tensed slightly beside her. "Mr. Brennan," she replied finally, "apology accepted. But I hope today teaches you something beyond just being careful about who you underestimate in public." "It has," Brennan said quietly. "More than you know." He hesitated, then extended his hand first to Jamila. "Mrs. Jackson, I'm sorry for how your case was handled. You deserved better." Jamila, after a moment's hesitation, accepted his handshake. Brennan then turned to Ali, visible awe in his expression as he faced the champion. "Mr. Ali, it's an honor. Your wife is formidable." A slow smile spread across Ali's face, his eyes twinkling with the charisma that had made him beloved worldwide. "Man, you don't know the half of it. Behind every strong man is an even stronger woman. I may be the greatest in the ring, but at home," he chuckled, wrapping an arm around Khalila's shoulders. "At home, she's the champion." The crowd laughed appreciatively, the tension of the moment broken. As they finally made their way to the car, a young black law student who had been watching the proceedings approached Khalila hesitantly. "Mrs. Ali," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I was in the courtroom today. I wanted to thank you. Seeing you stand up like that, knowing the law better than they did, wearing your faith proudly, it meant everything to me." Khalila took the young woman's hands in hers. "What's your name, sister?" "Aisha. Aisha Johnson. Remember today, Aisha. Remember that knowledge is power, and that justice requires courage. The world needs more lawyers who understand both." In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in Courtroom 3 appeared in newspapers across the country. Some accounts focused on the celebrity angle, Muhammad Ali's wife defending a friend in court, but others recognized the deeper significance of the moment, how prejudice and presumption had been overcome by knowledge and dignity. For Khalila Ali, the incident reinforced what she had always known, that the fight for justice took place not only in famous courtrooms and boxing rings, but in everyday moments when ordinary people refused to be diminished by the assumptions of others. And as letters began to arrive from Muslim women across America who had been inspired by her stand, she understood that sometimes the most powerful blow against injustice was simply showing up as your full, authentic self, ready to be heard. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing. I tell these stories with my heart in my hand, to reach people like you, who feel, who get emotional, who live. If this truly touched you, give back, comment, subscribe, come be part of this family with me until the next video.